Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Employers and Coronavirus, an Overview of Current Guidance. This webinar is being recorded and simultaneously translated in Spanish, so I will do a brief announcement. My name is Angelina Ceja, I'm with AgSave. I'll do a brief announcement in English, and then a brief announcement in Spanish, and then our presenter for today, Patrick Moody, will take over once I'm done with that introduction. So we have language selection directions. So step one is click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the webinar screen. You should have a button that shows up. If you prefer English, you can select English. Or if you prefer Spanish, you can select Spanish. The mute button selection. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and just use the chat function to let me know. Perfect. You can advance. Thank you. A las instrucciones para elegir el idioma, si es que está escuchando este webinario en español y lo quiere oír en español, puede oprimir la interpretación donde dice Spanish y luego ponga mute original audio para no escuchar inglés. Okay. Felicidades. Si tiene alguna pregunta, por favor, use la función de chat. Muchas gracias. Thank you. If you can't hear me for whatever reason, please adjust your volume on your computer or whatever other device you're using. If you called in, just know that you're on mute and we won't be able to hear you. So you would have to use the chat function in order to present or give us any information. So participants, you can use the chat function. We will not be able to hear you, okay? And we will be answering questions at the end. Just a couple of announcements. We're gonna have this presentation, it's being recorded. We will send out an email letting everyone know when the recording is ready. We also are graciously being able to provide you with a copy of this presentation as well after we're done with this. And if you can, please just ask your questions in the chat function. And at the end, once Pat is done doing the presentation, he will provide an opportunity for answering some questions, and then we'll do a Q&A there at the end as well that we hope to have ready for you sometime next week for those questions that are a little bit more complicated to answer. All right, so with this, I will leave you with Pat Moody. He is a partner with Barsamian and Moody. They're based out of Fresno. He works a lot with agricultural employers, and it's my pleasure to introduce him today as he will be presenting this information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pat Moody speaking. As was said, I'm going to go through some material here. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of concrete rules to follow in this area as of yet. So I'm going to hit some highlights. A lot of it is just recommendations that we've gotten from various governmental agencies and some of my own advice that I'm giving to my clients. So we've compiled that here. We'll go through this. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Make sure you type those into the chat function on the dialog box there from Zoom, and we'll answer questions at the end. Keep in mind, I can't hear you. You can only hear me. I can't hear you. So if you're trying to talk to me, I'm not going to be able to hear you. So just type your questions into the chat function, and then I will endeavor to answer as many questions as I can at the end, time permitting. But I do plan on leaving a number of time for a number of questions. So we're going to look a little bit about what Cal OSHA has had to say in dealing with this issue of coronavirus COVID-19. We're going to look at a little bit about what the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, the federal government has said. We're going to talk a little bit about what the EDD in California has talked about in terms of some wage and hour issues related to this. And so the Labor Commissioner guidance there and the EDD. We're going to talk some about that. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the Department of Fair Employment and Housing and what they've done in terms of this. Luckily, not a whole lot that we have to worry about from the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, but I do want to touch on a couple of the highlights in that area. And then once we're done with that, I will take questions. And the way that the question and answer will work is that the AgSafe staff is looking through the chat function and keeping track of the questions. And lots of it may be answered in the material I give. Those things that are not answered in the material I give, they will read those out, and then I will answer them sort of on the spot at the end of the written material that I do have. So with that said, let's take a look at what Cal OSHA has provided in terms of guidance and some of these health and safety measures. They've come out with sort of an overview recommendations that they want employers to consider adopting. One, of course, encouraging sick employees to stay home. We don't want employees who are sick with the symptoms of this showing up to work. We can, in fact, have employees sent home. So if you've got an employee who shows up, I had a client call me this morning and had an employee with the fever and the cough and the the chest issues and the difficulty breathing and the whole scenario like that. If you have those things with symptoms, you can send people home. The this is Cal OSHA has said, but on the federal level, the EEOC, which is responsible for dealing with some of the stuff on the federal level, has specifically issued a guidance that says that you can, in fact, send people home if they have symptoms, and that's not discriminatory or things like that. It's not disability discrimination. So you can send people home if they are showing these kinds of symptoms. They are encouraging, of course, and I'm sure most of you are doing this, but if you're not, let's get going in training employees on some basic issues that we need to deal with, cough and sneeze etiquette, coughing in your elbow and, covering sneezes and, hand hygiene, washing, the full 20 seconds with soap and water, which is the most effective way, I guess, of dealing with this stuff on your hands. Soap and water, good old soap and water, like your mom told you, is really good about taking care of this kind of stuff. So we want to encourage good hygiene in terms of hand washing. We do want to try and maintain that social distancing that we've heard so much about recently, and keeping some distance in between one another. If someone is sick, even if someone has this, apparently the latest medical information is even if somebody has this virus, if you stay at least 6 feet away and you don't touch them and they don't sneeze on you or cough on you, you're probably not going to get it. So to the extent that we can enforce some social distancing, try to do that. And so we want to, let people know that that's a pretty simple way to protect themselves. Just keep some distance from one another. Now, granted, there's going to be situations, I know, in dealing in agricultural employment where we may not be able to get that full 6 feet, but let's try as best we can where we can to do that and train people on that. Likewise, other hygiene, avoid touching your eyes and nose and mouth and your face. I was really kind of stunned when I saw the statistic that says that most people touch their face a couple of thousand times a day. It never dawned on me that people touch their face that often, but once I heard that, and now with this coronavirus, being in the public consciousness, I think everybody's a little more, cognizant of how often they actually do touch their face in a given day. So we want to make sure that people know that we don't want that. If you get this on your hands, the way you're going to get it is to somehow get it inside of your body by touching your eyes or your nose or your mouth and getting it into your body that way. So again, we want to avoid touching the face. We want to wash hands frequently. We want to avoid sharing personal items, cups and towels and dishes, things like that. So we don't want people drinking out of the same, Gatorade bottle or water bottle or something like that. We want to discourage that and make sure that the people are not doing that. So we want to do some training I would add this kind of training as part of your normal safety training. You want to, of course, document that you've provided this kind of training. There's tons of material out there that that talk about these various issues and what you should train on and what the hygiene is and how the virus is transmitted, whether you go to the CDC website, and I do have a link at the back of the material to the CDC website, you know, and you get something straight from the government, or if AgSafe has put something out, I don't know if they have or not. Maybe they can chime in later and let us know. And so they, you know, but if you've got training material that's utilized, you know, put it with the attendance sheet and make sure that you've got, you know, you can show that you've provided as much training as you can on this kind of stuff. So let's do that. Some more infection prevention methods. Make sure we've got lots of towels. You know, if we've got some no-touch trash cans and lots of hand sanitizer out there. Again, the hand sanitizer is good. It's not it's not the cure-all, end-all that some people think it is. The good old-fashioned soap and water is still the best. So let's make sure we've got plenty of that. Make sure our bathrooms are not out of soap and water, and towels, paper towels that are disposable, and things like that. So we have people that aren't touching, you know, again, the no-touch disposal, trash cans and things like that. Make sure we're doing lots of environmental cleaning of shared workspaces and equipment, that we are, you know, doing our normal cleaning. This does not mean that you have to go out and do some sort of super sanitation of your entire work place. You know, normal cleaning is what's good. That tends to be seen as effective. Just doing our normal cleaning. Let's just make sure we're doing that. We want to talk to employees. So if we've got employees who are traveling places, let's make sure we're looking at the CDC's website on health notices prior to having employees travel places. We are entitled to ask employees if they've traveled to places where this is a critical factor. You know, you can ask if they've been to Italy or if they've been on a cruise, things like that. We're allowed to ask that. And so those are things that we can do. And let's make sure that, you know, our employees are aware. We want to reassure our employees. We're very lucky in agriculture that we are deemed an essential industry, and that you know, we're able to stay open and we're able to keep our employees working, and our employees are able to continue to earn money. I guarantee you that your employees are, they know people whose businesses or their employers have closed. They're under the shelter in place and deemed a non-essential business, and they have closed. And so they've got people that they know who are struggling and on unemployment or whatever it might be. And so we want to make sure that we reassure our folks that yes, they are essential. Yes, they can come to work, and we're doing those things we can to make sure that our work place is safe for them. So we want to reassure our employees that they're going to be safe coming to work. I know it's a scary time out there, and I'm getting lots of calls from clients who have employees who are worried about this, and we want to make sure that that we are doing what we can to reassure our employees that we have a safe work environment. One of the things that comes up here is whether this is reportable if somebody has a coronavirus situation at work. So it's going to be reportable if the person, you know, passes away, or if they've got inpatient hospitalization for more than 24 hours. It's kind of the normal OSHA reporting stuff. And it's as a result of coronavirus contracted from performing work-related duties. The problem we've got here is, how do we know that? You know, did somebody get exposed to the virus at work, or did they get exposed to the virus going to the grocery store, or you know, going to the gas station, or some other non-work related function? How are we going to know that? I think that's something that we're going to have to just make best good faith decisions on, and say that, you know, whether we think it is or isn't, and be prepared just like any other time, so that if OSHA were to come and say, hey, why didn't you report this? You know, why is this not recorded? Then we want to be able to say why and have a good faith explanation for why we did or why we didn't. So we want to make sure that thing. So reporting guidelines is, again, it's the same as any other serious injury. Report a fatality within 8 hours, hospitalization within 24 hours. So let's make sure that we're following those guidelines with this. Again, the issue we have is, how are we going to know whether this is coronavirus related or not? And all you can really do, I believe, is to make your best good faith decisions on that. And if you've got somebody who is working in close proximity with other workers, on a packing line or something like that, and they're close proximity, and two of the employees end up with a confirmed positive coronavirus test, and then other people there that worked with them get sick. Well, maybe that's probably something that you're going to say they got it at work. If there's no such thing like that, then we're just going to have to make our best guess, and be in good faith and be able to say why we chose either to report or not report. And so if OSHA shows up, and we can explain to them why we didn't report. Recordable, it's going to be the same thing, recording. So if they get medical treatment beyond first aid, they go to the doctor, they get some sort of prescription to deal with this. The doctor imposes restricted duty. You have to be quarantined. We want you to stay home, something like that. There's lost work. So those types of same things are going to apply here. So if it's recordable and it were something other than coronavirus, it's going to be recordable if it is related to coronavirus. And again, we're just going to have to make that best good faith decision on what's recordable and what's not. Let's look now at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and some of the information they've put together. So some of the things that they've talked about here, and some of this can be applicable to some parts of your organization, and some of this just isn't going to be applicable. So allowing flexible work sites, telecommuting, you might be able to have office personnel telecommute and work at home. Obviously we can't have field workers work at home, or packing shed employees work at home. We've got to have them where the work is. But if there's ways to do that for some of the workforce, at least consider it. And if there's ways to increase physical distance between employees and achieve that 6 foot social distancing measure that they are encouraging, at least look at how show you've looked at it in ways that you might be able to do it. And if it's impractical, there's no way to do it, you can at least show that you've looked at it and you've tried to do the best you possibly can to do so, and try and achieve that. Whatever else you can do to minimize exposure between your employees and or between employees and the public. Some operations are having front doors to offices closed, and if somebody wants to come in, they've got to call and say why they want to come in. If there's ways to put physical barriers between employees. I know when I go to my my local Save Mart store to buy groceries, they now have a big plastic barrier in between the customer on one side of the aisle who's having their groceries rung up, and the cashier on the other side of the aisle, on the other side of the conveyor belt there, and they're behind a big plastic kind of a barrier now. If that's something that you can work for at least some of your workplace, look at it. Is that something you can do, or is it not something you can do? So you want to show that you've considered these things. Of course, postponing or canceling large work-related meetings. We're using today Zoom as the provider for this webinar. I've started using this same provider for meetings with clients and whatnot. And so this is a way to conduct meetings or trainings and have people separate, not everybody in one conference room kind of thing. So to the extent that you can utilize something like that, and I have no specific tie to Zoom. I'm not trying to plug them as the best or anything like that, but that is somebody, it's just one I'm familiar with. There's lots of other providers like that. There's Skype, and there's all sorts of other providers that do that. But to the extent you can do some of that and keep that social distancing that they talk about, look at how you can do that and what you can do to achieve that and keep people apart. So let's look at the EDD guidance concerning the time away from work and some of the things that they've said here. So disability insurance claims, if you have somebody who is sick or quarantined and they cannot come to work because they've gone to the doctor and the doctor has said you should go home and self-quarantine, they can file a disability claim, and the state is going to look at that and probably grant them disability insurance for a short time. There's, you know, the disability insurance, I forget what the exact rate of pay on that is, but they can at least continue to get some sort of their pay through a disability insurance claim with the state. If they're unable to work, you know, because they're taking care of a sick family member, they can get California paid family leave through the state disability insurance fund, just like they could for other reasons. So that's 6 weeks of pay if they need to take off to care for a serious ill family member. They can file for a paid family leave claim under the state of California disability insurance program. If there's reduced hours or there's a shutdown in operations, of course, employees can apply for unemployment. The state has very early in this, the state said that they were going to not enforce any waiting time for unemployment. You can get employees can go in and get unemployment claims granted almost immediately. So if they, you know, if you have to slow down your operation and you're, instead of working 6 days a week, your employees are only working 4 days a week, they can go in and get unemployment for that 2 days a week that they're losing. There are some, you know, again, it's not full pay, but they're able to get some of their pay. They do have to be able to remain available and ready to work during that time while they're getting unemployment, but the state has eased the waiting period for your employees if they, for some reason, need to file for unemployment due to reduced hours or, you know, an actual closure for some places. There is some information out there on ways that employers can get help with some of this stuff. So that there's this unemployment insurance work sharing program through the state that says if you apply for this and you get this, you're the employer who's saying, you know, I don't want to lay people off. I would like to keep going. You know, I'm in an essential industry. Again, we're lucky to be in agriculture, and we would like to continue this. There's a way to get this some help through the work sharing program, and so that the employer can keep these people going as an alternative to layoffs. There is, in the newly passed CARES Act that was just signed, there's some information in there also on applying for some loans through the federal government, where I don't have that in the material here. This material was put together before the CARES Act was signed. And so that's not in here, but there is a way to apply for some loans through the federal government that can be forgiven. So you get the loans, it covers a few months period of time. It's a very temporary period of time. I think up through June 30th. And I think that's the date, but don't quote me on that. And you can get this loan to pay salaries for people that you might otherwise have to lay off. And if you show you did that and you used it for the reasons that are approved, then the loan will actually be forgiven. And so that's another way you might get some help. As that there's this also, the state has this rapid response program to the state can come out and talk to you and your employees about ways to help avert layoffs and to help employees who are facing job losses and what they can do in terms of, you know, filing for unemployment, or, you know, if you need some help with this unemployment sharing program that we just talked about on the prior slide. There is this state program where they can come out and help with that. Keep in mind that if you are going to do sort of a closure or a mass layoff, do keep in mind that the WARN Act is still out there. Both the federal and the state WARN Act still apply even in this situation. So if for some reason you have to close down, the WARN Act does comply. You have to comply with it. Now the state at least has made some changes in terms of the state WARN Act, and is not going to require the full normal 60 days notice before a mass layoff or a plant closure. And as long as you can demonstrate why you didn't give the full 60 days notice and show how it is related, in fact, to this coronavirus situation, then there is a way to get less than 60 days notice and still comply. But keep that in mind. You can't just lay everybody off and not worry about the WARN Act. So if that's something that you were thinking about doing, or you face that in the future, make sure you consult with experienced labor counsel who knows how to deal with the WARN Act and the implications of doing that, and what all you have to do. It's not that hard to comply with, but failure to comply means you may owe your employees up to 60 days worth of pay for failure to comply with the WARN Act. So we don't want to forget that. There's some tax assistance you can get here through the EDD, whether it's this extension of for up to 60 days to submit payroll tax reports and deposit state payroll taxes. There's some issues on the federal level that are not covered on this presentation. I don't know how many of you were on yesterday's presentation. We talked some about the tax credits that you can get on the federal level, but here on the state level is a way to have a delay in paying your payroll taxes. You have to submit a request and get that approved through the EDD, but there's a way to do so. Talk to your tax professional about that and see what they can do. Let's talk a little bit about what the Labor Commissioner has said. The Labor Commissioner has posted a FAQ on their website. I've got a link here to that. It primarily deals with paid sick leave and how that applies in this situation dealing with coronavirus. Obviously, paid sick leave can be used to deal with this care for a family member, or to if they're going for a diagnosis or whatnot. So if you've got paid sick leave available and on the employees, they can use this. It's up to 6 weeks. We talked about a little bit earlier, 6 weeks of a reduced pay to get some paid sick leave that would otherwise be unpaid. There's also here, we don't have that again in this program because we talked about it yesterday in yesterday's program, the federal paid sick leave. We talked about that in detail yesterday, 80 hours of paid sick leave for employees on the federal level. And so that's something that's out there as well. Preventative care is, that could include that self-quarantine. If somebody comes and says, hey, I've got these symptoms, I need to quarantine, or if they've gone to the doctor and the doctor, there's very few people actually still getting tested. There's not a lot of tests out there for people to take to determine whether they actually have this coronavirus or not. And so you may end up with somebody just being said, hey, my doctor told me to quarantine because I might have this. Not that I do, but I might have this. And so if that happens, then they can use paid sick leave for that just under self-quarantine. Now, note, that's one thing that is going to be different from the federal level, where somebody wanting to take federal paid sick leave under the new FMLA, emergency FMLA statute, them deciding for themselves that they want to stay home wouldn't suffice for federal paid sick leave. Here, it would suffice for state paid sick leave. Exhausting paid sick leave, if they're not qualified to use paid sick leave, they haven't worked for you long enough or whatever that might be, or they've exhausted all of it. Employees can take, if you've got some sort of other company policy, whether it's vacation or paid time off policy, or you grant paid sick leave above and beyond the 3 days, 24 hours, if you're in California. And so there's ways that if you've got a company policy that be able to use that. You cannot force people to utilize their paid sick leave. You can't force that. It's up to the employee to decide whether they want to do that. You can require that it be done in a minimum of 2 hours. Now, this is here again where we've got this unfortunate scenario where we've got California law and federal law that's a little bit different. And in federal law, there's talking about, you know, if you're looking at some of this stuff, it's full day increments. So we want to make sure that you know, we know what we're doing under each law and what's allowed to be used on each day. But we do know that under both state and federal, you cannot require them to use paid sick leave. It's up to the employee to decide what they do. Again, I mentioned we can require employees to tell us if they're planning to travel or have traveled to places where the CDC has said this is a high risk area for exposure, you know, whether they've gone to China or to, you know, Italy, who got hit very, very hard with this stuff. So while you can't, you know, violate privacy rights, because of this, the nature of this, we are able to ask some of this information and get that information from our employees, and they have to provide that to you. Keep in mind, reporting time pay may be applicable if we've got somebody who shows up and they have symptoms and we send them home. You know, reporting time pay is probably going to come into play. Or if we have reduced hours on a given day because, you know, somebody tests positive and we've got to send people home because they came in contact with somebody who is actually positive, then, you know, you might have to look at whether reporting time pay comes into play there. You know, no less than 2 hours, no more than 4 hours for the regular schedule for that day. So you've got somebody that shows up for 8 hours, only works 1 hour. They've got to get, you know, no less than 2, no more than 4. So they have to, they're going to get reporting time pay. So we want to make sure that that we're thinking of that if that comes into play. For exempt employees, and if you've got exempt employees, if they perform work during a new work week, they're entitled to their full weekly salary. If they don't work at all during the work week, then they don't have to get paid for that week. If they are out of leave available under the state or federal law or company policy, and they take off for their own personal reasons, then they can have a pro rata deduction and not ruin their exempt status. So keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about what the DFEH has done, Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Obviously, it's unlawful to discriminate. We've seen in the news, I don't know if anybody else has seen some of this, but there's been some discrimination against Asian Americans who are, you know, there's been people who are calling them names and refusing to work with people because they look Chinese, and this is, you know, somehow you know, somehow because they look Chinese, they have this issue. So we got to make sure that that's not coming into play. This is one of the things that the DFEH, when you look at their FAQs that they put out on coronavirus, it mostly has to do with anti-discrimination. So they just, I guess, are reminding us that doesn't come into play. So so that just, you know, we want to make sure that that's not going on. That can crop up in a situation like this. Here, CDC has again said that you can send people home if they've got symptoms, that the Department of Fair Employment and Housing has agreed that does not violate the state California Family Rights Act. You can send people with symptoms home and make sure that they are not then, you know, at work while they're sick. So you're going to have to provide paid sick leave if it's applicable, and, you know, the paid sick leave laws, whether it's, you know, the paid family leave, or, you know, whether the state or federal paid sick leave comes into play, or if you've got company policy that comes into play. Again, once sick leave is exhausted, if there's vacation or other paid time off or some other unpaid leave that they might be entitled to, you got to look at all of that stuff and make sure that people are getting the time off that they need. Again, we are able to ask employees if they're experiencing coronavirus symptoms, fever, chills, cough, sore throat. We have to keep that stuff confidential, of course. One of the things that the federal government has came out and said, and there's been no counter view so far from the state, that you can take employees' temperatures. I don't know how many of you have seen, but some counties have started putting out some information on this. And the county of Fresno, where I live, on Friday afternoon, sort of late in the day, without telling anybody, put out a county order from the county health officer saying that employers have to go through a questionnaire every morning with every employee before they come into work. They clearly didn't think about how that's going to work in agriculture, where, you know, if you've got 400 people trying to go into a packing shed or into a field and working in a field, you know, now they're saying essentially you got to congregate everybody together and go through a questionnaire, and then it's paid time, I'm assuming. So they didn't really think that through, but we're dealing with some of these counties trying to throw stuff in here. Make sure you know what your counties are requiring and not requiring in terms of that. So just be aware that some of that stuff is out there. We talked about this. I just talked about this. You can, in fact, take employees' temperature. If an employee doesn't show up, you're able to always ask why an employee who is otherwise supposed to be at work didn't show up. So if they, you know, if they say, "Hey, I went to get tested for coronavirus because my spouse has it," or, you know, "I was with my you know, so and so and they had it, and so I'm getting tested," that's confidential medical information. But you are, in fact, able to ask people who are supposed to be at work why they're not at work. That's not a disability related inquiry, and you are able to ask that. If an employee is quarantined or tests positive or comes in contact with somebody let's not, you know, identify that person. But what we want to do is, you know, contact your local health department. They're going to have specific advice on what you may be required to do, whether it's, you know, just enforcing social distancing or extra cleaning or whatever it might come into play. It might be a situation where if you have an employee who tells you, "Hey, I tested positive for coronavirus," you're going to want to get together and figure out where all, you know, they were in your work environment and who they might have come into contact with, and tell those people that, you know, we have an employee who has tested positive, and you may have come into contact with that person. So you might want to either seek, you know, a medical diagnosis, or, you know, at least self-monitor for symptoms, and let them know that that's something that they are going to want to be aware of. There's not a blanket obligation to send everybody home. If you have an employee who ends up with a positive test, there is not this blanket obligation, "Hey, I have to send everybody home." That's not the case. We just need to be extra careful and keep people looking for symptoms that they might have, and whether they need to, you know, just keep an eye on their own potential symptoms, or whether they decide they want to self-quarantine or they want to go to the doctor and see if they can get tested or whatnot. But keep in mind that when somebody tells us, you know, that they've tested positive for this, or they think they've got this, that is confidential medical information. We don't want to reveal that to other employees. We want to have some sort of you know, blanket generic statement. Here's just a sample email that it was put out. You know, we've learned an employee has tested positive. They received positive results on XYZ day. That, you know, you may have been exposed, and contact your local health department for guidance and you know, see what you want to do. So something generic like this that you want to tailor to yourself is fine for letting people know that. We want to talk about, you know, personal protective gear. There's lots of questions about face masks and whether those help or not. The latest scientific people, you know, doctors, you know, the CDC are still saying that, you know, wearing a mask is not necessary. It's really more if you have it, or you're going to be in contact with it. You know, if you work in a hospital and you're going to be coming in contact with people who have this virus, it may make sense. But if you're just going about your day-to-day business, it probably doesn't make sense to wear a mask. But if there's a situation where we need to do that, and you know, you've got somebody who has a latex allergy, and so we've got to make sure we've got non-latex gloves for that person. So those kinds of things. It would come into this whole idea of accommodating your employees unless it becomes an undue hardship to do so. There's, of course, California Family Rights Act leave that can come into play if somebody is in fact having a serious health condition due to coronavirus, or they've got a child or a parent who has coronavirus. This is unpaid leave. Now, again, we talked extensively yesterday about the paid leave under the federal Family Medical Leave Act. Having to do with school closures or daycare closures related to coronavirus. For purposes of this, the CFRA, it is unpaid, but they may qualify for leave. You know, I would have to think that, you know, if somebody gets coronavirus, that's going to qualify as a serious health condition. They're going to go to the doctor. They're going to get some sort of continued course of treatment, or they're going to see the doctor repeatedly. There's, you know, the definition of serious health condition is pretty broad. It's sort of beyond the scope of today's talk, but it probably would qualify. If employees need leave, we are entitled to ask for certification. You know, the doctor told me to self-quarantine, or I've tested positive and I'm supposed to quarantine for 14 days or whatever that might be. We are entitled to ask for and receive documentation of that. So we want to look, though, whether, again, because the availability of tests is limited, it may not be possible for an employee to come to us and say, yes, I've tested positive and therefore, you know, I need to quarantine. They may not get that test, but if their doctor says you need to quarantine because you might have it, that's going to suffice, but we want to get a doctor's note. So we want to make sure that we are entitled to request this documentation. And if employees want to take advantage of the benefits under the various laws that they get rights under, they have to work with us on that and provide the documentation. You know, if there's an accommodation we can make, if someone can work from home, you know, and that works out, great, we can do that. But you're going to have to look at a case by case to see, you know, whether that's something that could work for that particular situation. Again, we got to do undue hardships unless reasonable accommodation, unless it becomes an undue hardship. And that's just a case by case scenario we're going to have to look at and decide whether it is or isn't. Again, we talked about requiring documentation. You can. The DFEH is recommending waiving such requirements. That's really up to you. If you want to waive the documentation, you can. You don't have to. You can, in fact, require it. If you choose not to, then you choose not to. That's really a business decision that you get to decide what you want to do for your particular company and how you guys want to handle that situation. Here's a list of places where you can go and get additional information. That Department of Labor FAQ there toward the bottom is very, very good. You are required to post posters on this. Again, if you weren't on yesterday's presentation, I've got a link to both posters. It's a single poster in English and Spanish. I've got that there. And so we've got the AgSafe resource page listed here. You can look at their resource page too on various things. We've got the resource page for my law firm. We've got Cal OSHA there. So there's a lot of stuff on here you can go look at. There's lots of other resources. Again, I don't have the link here to the CDC, but that's a good place to go look for sort of the scientific kind of information if you want to educate yourself some. So with that said, why don't I have, there's my contact information. If you need to contact me, you can do so. But I'm going to leave that resource page up there. So with that said, why don't we have the folks from AgSafe who are monitoring the questions go ahead and deal with those, and I will answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have some really great questions. Please just continue to use the chat function, and I will go in periodically as I read these and see if there's anything new. Okay. Do they have to pay reporting time pay? I think you went over this. This was one of the earlier ones. If someone shows up someone goes to work and is showing symptoms, and then the employer sends them home?
Yes, that is a situation where you would pay reporting time pay. So they are missing work, and so that's a reporting time pay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because they showed up, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So if an employee travels out of the country, or maybe perhaps to a large city, they kind of threw a couple of things here. Large city in California, is the employer allowed to ask the employee to self-quarantine for 14 days before returning to work?
I don't know that just having gone somewhere would allow you to require that person to self-quarantine. The information that they put out said that you can do so if the person is showing symptoms. So I think what they would say is, absent showing some sort of symptoms, the mere fact that someone has, gone to a large city, or they've traveled to China, or they've traveled to Italy, the mere fact that they've done that wouldn't allow you to require them to self-quarantine. Right? Everything I've seen so far says you can do so if they're showing symptoms, though.
And then what would be your recommendation for onboarding of seasonal workers? Handing them a packet and asking them to complete, say, the paperwork stuff that a lot of employers sometimes fill out for workers,
Mm-hmm.
and then paying them a minimum of 2 hours for completing the paperwork. How would you
Yeah, I
recommend
actually,
handling those onboarding situations?
yeah, I had a client ask me in specific with regard to I-9s the other day, what's the best way to do that? Because you're handing documents back and forth, and you, of course, with an I-9, you're required to look at the original documents the employee provides you. So I think this kind of advice would apply sort of in this general area as well too. What I recommended is sort of setting up a kind of two-stage place where you've got an employee who comes up to a table. If you've got applications, or W-4s or I-9s or whatever it might be, they fill out their section. You then your employee is standing back at least 6 feet away. When they're done, they can go up and do their portion of what they need to do. So the people are practicing social distancing. I would suggest having if you're not in a place to have washing for soap and water, having the hand sanitizer so people can sanitize their hands before and after touching things, making sure we're wiping down pens and we're wiping down tables with cleaning product, to do the best we can to try and avoid some sort of cross-contamination. I think it makes people, it reassures them that we're doing what we can, and we are in fact doing the best we can to try and avoid some sort of exposure like that. And yes, if it's compensable time, you're going to have to pay them. Because that's not, if someone's just showing up to fill out paperwork, that's not a regular shift. So you can pay them for the amount of time that they're there. You wouldn't have to pay reporting time pay for that, because they're not really showing up for an extended shift. Reporting time pay says that if you are showing up for your regularly scheduled shift, you're going to get paid for half of that shift, whether it's at least 2 hours, no more than 4 hours. But if you're just showing up to fill out paperwork for onboarding, and that might take an hour, then your whole day is an hour, and so you wouldn't have to pay a minimum of 2 hours for that. So reporting time pay is going to be a little different for that.
Okay, perfect. All right. So there's a couple of questions around thermometer, about testing people, taking people's temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the liability that you can see, or advice maybe, of doing temperature readings at work, and then documentation that is required, or that you would use to document that.
Here's the thing, is that the fact that somebody has a fever does not mean they've got this. On the other side of that, people who have this may not have a fever. So I'm not sure what good it's going to do to take temperature. Now, granted, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a infectious disease specialist. I'm an attorney. I didn't go to medical school. I went to law school. So I think that there are lots of people who, when they saw the EEOC say you're allowed to take people's temperatures, said, great, I'm going to do that. But now, again, that's a medical test, and you're going to have to treat that confidentially and keep that information separate. There's at least an issue out there of whether that's some sort of Consumer Privacy Act interaction there, and whether that's something that we would have to provide notice that we're going to do that beforehand. I don't think that's the case, but I've had a client ask me about that today. But yeah, if you decide you want to take people's temperatures, keep in mind that it is in fact a medical exam, and you're gonna have to keep that information confidential. But again, the latest wisdom is that people that have this may not have a fever, and people who have a fever may not have this. So I don't know how conclusive taking someone's temperature is going to be, but if you're going to do so, just be aware that that's information you're going to have to keep confidential.
Okay. If an employee is letting a business know that they're going to see a doctor, do you recommend that the company create some sort of form that says that they would like to take their paid sick leave? I think you talked about this a little bit.
There is, you can either modify your existing forms for, FMLA, CFRA leave, or sick leave, whatever you have. I know that there's floating out there a number of various places have put together sample leave request forms. It has the one category that you can take expanded family leave for under the new federal act for childcare or school closures, and the 6 ways to get paid sick leave under the new federal law, and circle the one that applies to you and explain why it applies to you. So if you want to do something like that, I mean, for example, Ventura County Ag Association put one of those out today. I'm not advocating theirs over anybody else's, but I just happen to see that today. So if that's something you want, but you can also take your own forms and modify them for this purpose. But I think it's like anything else, if you've got employees who are requesting leave, you probably want to have some sort of documentation of what's going on. So, if it's the federal leave, they get their 80 hours. If it's paid family leave under the state of California, that's their 6 weeks that they're entitled to get benefits for. If it's paid sick leave under California's 3 days 24 hours thing, you got to track that for purposes of showing it on the check stub. So you're going to want to have ways to track this kind of stuff. And so I think it makes sense to have some documentation. I don't know that there's any magic way to do it that's inherently better than other ways. Whatever works for you, do so. You should have procedures in place for other types of leave, and this can be modified for this situation.
Okay. So I think this was what you covered yesterday, for FFCRA, that covers the 10 weeks at 2/3 pay.
Mm-hmm.
What do you base the wages on the pay if they're piece rate employees? So how are they averaging for piece rate?
So if you look at the DOL FAQs, they sort of explain that, but really it's akin to how you would calculate NPT time. So when you're going to take total compensation divided by hours and come up with your regular rate of pay, and that's so how you do it for NPT is pretty it's the same thing for this. You're going to calculate all the wages and the hours worked, and you're going to figure out what their regular rate of pay is, and you would do the same thing for this.
Okay, perfect. This one was asking about validating thermometer readings and then training the employee that's actually taking the readings.
Right.
And protocol for doing that with a packing house where there's over 400 employees.
I think it's completely impractical to try and do that, because you're going to have 400 people standing there in line waiting to get their temperature taken. I have a very good friend who's a safety person for a company, and the first thing he asked me about when he saw this was, how often do I have to have my thermometer calibrated?
Correct.
And I'm thinking, well, does it really make sense to take the temperature if we're worrying about how often we have to have the thermometer calibrated, right? So I think as much as it gives people, I think, some sort of comfort to say, hey, my employer is taking temperatures, or if you're the company, you're saying, hey, I'm taking temperatures before I let 400 people come into my packing shed. I'm taking everybody's temperature. But think about, how are you going to enforce social distancing while you do that? How are you going to pay for all these people who are waiting out there to get their temperature taken? How reliable is the thermometer you have? Does it even matter whether they what the temperature says, because people who have this may not have a temperature, and people who have a temperature may not have this. So I understand people want to take those temperatures. I don't see the huge advantage in doing so. Maybe I'm thinking of it incorrectly, but you just got to think about that. And so if you are taking somebody's temperature and it says, hey, they're 101 on the thermometer that you used, and you send them home, now can they challenge that and say, hey, your thermometer is wrong? I just went to my doctor. My doctor said, or I went home and I used my thermometer at home, and it said 98.7. So I don't have a temperature. Those kinds of issues, I think, are going to crop up for employers who are insistent upon taking people's temperatures. I think that's something that you're going to have to think about coming to fruition if you decide to take temperatures.
Right. Perfect. So the Fresno County, there are a couple of questions around Fresno County, the health screenings and the questionnaires.
Yeah.
So who are the questionnaires in Fresno County referring to? Is it everyone in the county or city limits? Is there anyone who's accepted?
Did this just show up on the screen? Can you
yes,
see
it did.
Okay, so this is the Fresno County checklist. And so this is for non-medical employers. And so what it says here is all employees and visitors entering the building should be asked the following questions at the beginning and end of every workday. And so here's what they want you to do. They want you to go through this questionnaire, and this is put out by the County of Fresno. So this applies to every employer in Fresno County, for example. All right, so this is Fresno County's. This is what they want you to ask every employee and every visitor twice a day. So I had a client ask me about this yesterday. Again, this came out Friday afternoon, late in the afternoon, without any publication from the county. They didn't tell anybody they were doing this. They didn't tell anybody they were considering doing this. And does anybody want to have some input on this? And is this going to work? Is it not going to work? It just sort of one person, the county health person, put this out without consulting anybody. And so I think about that. If you're that packing shed with 400 people, and you're going to line these people all up in a little line, standing, front to back in a line while you ask them all these questions, right? And you're going to ask all these questions, and you're going to say, do this for 400 people twice a day. It makes no sense whatsoever. You got them all grouped up together in a big group of no social distancing. Think about how long this would take for 400 people. Yeah. Twice a day. It's crazy. Okay, so dealing with the county, we're actually dealing with the county right now to try and tell them that this is nuts, and so please don't do this. But as of right now, this is a requirement in Fresno County.
Yeah. So we had someone just put in their chat that that the county confirmed that you only have to do the screening at the beginning of the workday, and that they've put up some clarification language. So maybe, Pat, after this, you can check the County Office of Emergency Service.
Yeah.
So maybe possibly as we're doing this, they've gone around and done some other tweaking, since they just kind of sent it out and didn't really give a lot of guidance, and people are probably pushing back. So it's probably
I know that
happening.
We did a lot of pushing back yesterday and today, and so that may be us doing that. So yeah. So anyway, this is an example of what Fresno County is doing, and other counties are doing other things. I read through Sonoma County's county order just before we went live today. Theirs does not have this kind of questionnaire, but they do have this very, very long order explaining who's entitled to stay open, who isn't entitled to stay open, and things like that. And things you're supposed to do if you're an essential business to stay open, the things you're supposed to do. But this is the most intrusive thing I've seen from a county so far.
Yeah, it's pretty robust there.
Yeah, that's one way of saying it. I said crazy.
Yeah. PC today. Okay. So there is talk that CDC is revisiting face masks and may make a recommendation that people wear them. Mm-hmm. If they maybe do the recommendation, it hasn't happened yet. As employers, where are employers supposed to get the face masks considering there's just such a short supply?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the CDC might want to think about that before they make that a requirement. You have to issue face masks. Great. Where am I going to get them? Right. So yeah, I wish I could tell you, hey, go to Tractor Supply or go to Gempler's or one of those places that sells workplace supplies and see if you can get some, because you're going to find out they don't have any. So yeah, I would hope that they think about that before they do this.
Okay. Okay. So what happens if you want the doctor potentially to mail you in the documentation showing that the employee tested positive for corona?
The doctor is not going to mail you that. Does the doctor mail you test results for anything else? No, they're not going to do it for this. And again, most doctors don't have the ability to actually test patients. What they're going to say is, it sure looks like you might have it. You should go home and self-quarantine, and your employee should be able to get a note from the doctor saying so. But the doctor is not going to mail it directly to you.
Okay. Let me see. This is a question in regards to, I think, both federal and state leaves. If the employer is required to pay, right, if they're doing the federal extension of FMLA for a person that, qualifies for that, can the employee file for state FMLA for the same activity?
So yeah, here's the thing. The state California Family Rights Act, which is the counterpart to FMLA on the federal level, is all unpaid. So there's no paid. So you would run this concurrently. So if somebody has, so for example, somebody has, they become ill and they need to go home and it qualifies as a serious health condition under the FMLA, it's going to qualify as a serious health condition under the CFRA, and you would run them concurrently. But they're not going to, people aren't going to be able to double dip and get extra pay, because again, the state is not requiring anything to be paid as of yet. Only the federal is. And again, the federal pay is only for that limited reason we talked about yesterday: school closures and childcare. And then the paid sick leave is only for 80 hours. It's not 12 weeks of paid leave for all reasons.
And for those 80 hours, there's a couple of questions on the 80 hours. It does have to show up on their pay stub, correct?
I would certainly think so, yeah.
Right? You want to make sure you're including that.
They didn't say that anywhere, but I would certainly think it has to.
Okay. And then...
And I would designate it as, emergency FMLA paid sick leave.
Okay. And since the 80 hours of this emergency sick leave are, again, the employer is responsible for this. Nothing ever happens. No exchange with social security numbers, like none of that is occurring, correct? Okay.
Nope.
So those were the, is there any different process for H-2A visa workers?
No, this is equally applicable to H-2A workers. There's no difference.
If an employee is on unemployment, so you've already laid them off, I'm assuming, are they eligible to take paid sick leave?
No, because they're not off because they're sick. They're off because they're unemployed, so they
Okay.
get unemployment.
Okay. Will the expanded family leave apply during the summer months when school is not in session?
It will apply in certain circumstances. There are year-round schools at various places in California. So if you have an employee who attends one of those year-round schools, it could potentially apply. And remember, it's also daycare. So if the daycare is closed because the daycare provider is closed due to coronavirus, that would also apply there. But yeah, once the school year is out and an employee can't say, hey, I need to take this leave because my kid's school is closed if the kid's not in school,
Okay.
or wouldn't be in school. Right.
Okay. Okay, so if the employee only works for a few days and then decides to take the leave, they're asking a pay question. Should you do 2 separate checks, or is it just all one?
I think you can do just a single paycheck, but again, you're going to want to designate, just like you would anything else that is, unique on a pay issue. You want it to show up on the check stub and make sure the check stub is reasonably understandable by an average employee. They can look at their check stub and figure out what they got paid and how it was calculated and what it is.
Perfect. And then, so the emergency leave of the 80 hours, the extended sick leave, and the FMLA federal extensions are only up until December of this year, correct?
Correct.
December
That is a
31st.
temporary statute. By its terms, it expires on December 31. If they come through sometime between then and extend it, and we're going to hear about that, but by its own terms, it expires on December 31.
Okay. And then if we're calling it, is it daycare or whoever takes care of children, so babysitter or someone else? Are they that specific in their language?
I would have to say that if we looked at the DOL FAQs, it may address that. I don't recall it being specifically addressed. So I don't know that there's an answer to that yet, but if there was an answer to that, it would be in the DOL FAQs, which I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's the link to it right there. It's the second to the last link, or third to the last link on this resources page.
Okay. Okay. I think I think I captured, oh, of course. So don't use the Q&A. So I have to go look into different spots. Okay. Just as a point of clarification for everyone, we will go ahead, Pat, I think we're PDFing your presentation. We'll go ahead and we'll include in a separate document all of the links associated so people can click through and get the links. There was a question on that with the links. Just be patient with us. We're going to try to get this all done before the end of this week. But I know that the audio or the video for yesterday is up, along with your presentation, which is probably a PDF. And we'll get those resources the links as well for people to have that access. The other thing, Pat, that you mentioned, if AgSafe had at the beginning of your presentation was any resources for training.
Right.
Myself and Amy just worked on both English and Spanish employee tips. Very short videos, and we loosely call them videos, but you can play them and see a PowerPoint presentation about just recommendations we're giving to employers about what they need to do, but you can play this for the employee. And then we have a checklist for employers about some guidance, just general guidance about distancing and cleaning and sanitizing and all of that good stuff as well. So we did include, we also have that included as well.
So yeah, if you are doing that as training for your employees, just make sure that you've
always document. Yeah,
you've documented, you've captured a copy of it, so that you can say, here's what I showed. Just like if you're doing heat stress training, you're going to show the material that you used, or sexual harassment training, you're going to show the material you used. Same thing for this. You have the material that you used available.
Perfect. Alrighty. So I think with that, I believe I've captured most of the questions. Again, I am putting together, so if you ask some questions in the Q&A, we're putting together a document, a standalone document that has the frequently asked questions on this webinar as well. for everyone to have access to that information as well.
Great.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Pat, for your time and
Absolutely.
your assistance with this. And thank you all for your patience. We will also be sending out some information on the Fresno County stuff. I think it's a moving target right now. So Pat, if you see something, we're happy to send out to our network as well.
Great.
On
Yeah,
the
I'll
guidance
let
for
you know.
Fresno. Okay.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.